Alrighty, we'll get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's final webinar. My name is Andrew Calnon, for those of you who do not know. I feel like I've done this introduction a few times today, but it's nice to see all of you, and thank you for joining us tonight during Virtual Alumni Week. I'm really excited for this webinar tonight with Matthew Pinsker, a professor of history at Dickinson, who will be talking about the Dickinson and Slavery Project, giving us an update on what's going on with that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Matt. We will be open to questions as well throughout the presentation. Matt will dictate when he's kind of looking for those. So Matt, it's all you know.
So thanks, Andrew. And, I'm happy to be here with everybody. I have to admit, especially this week, over the last couple of weeks, it feels kind of sad and frustrating that a project like this seems so relevant to what's happening in our world. But I'll focus, for about 10 minutes on the history of our project here, how it came about, maybe just give a quick overview of where it's heading next. And then I'll pause and maybe give people a chance to make some comments or ask some questions. And then over the course of the discussion, we could probably talk about how this project fits into the current climate and what's happening, around the country if people want to. I see there are a couple of people on the call who are involved in the project in different ways, so I'll make sure to try to give them a chance to talk as well. And in a minute, I'll share some images and maybe a short video from my screen just so that you can see some elements of the Dickinson and Slavery Project kind of in action. But just to give background at this stage, I started teaching a slavery course on campus in the fall of 2017. And part of that class was devoted to projects about the connections between Dickinson and slavery and anti-slavery. And some of the students did really strong projects that culminated their work in the class. And that gave birth to the idea that we could have an entire initiative that was student faculty led that would offer insight into the school's history with the institution of slavery. We weren't the first school by any means to do that. This has been going on for the last 20 years in different places. It started in the Ivy League in places like Brown and Harvard and Yale, but it's spread. Now there's a consortium of universities studying slavery across the world. We're the only school, I think, currently from Pennsylvania that's part of that consortium, but there are hundreds of schools involved all over the place. In the United States, the concentration of schools studying their ties to slavery is densest in the South. But as most of you know, slavery existed in the North and the South. It existed in Pennsylvania, in Cumberland County in particular, right up through the 1840s. Slavery in Pennsylvania was abolished in Pennsylvania in 1780, but it was gradual abolition. So the institution lingered, and there were enslaved people who were involved in life in Carlisle as Dickinson was coming into existence. It doesn't appear to us, after all of our research, that the school owned any slaves or that any of the administrators on campus owned slaves. But there were slaves that were hired out by local slaveholders to help build the initial outcroppings on campus and the buildings. So slavery was, from the beginning, part of the school story. The work that my students did was both in class and also as interns for the House Divided Project. I have been leading this House Divided Project on campus for the last 15 years. It's a kind of multimedia initiative that really aims at K through 12 classrooms. And Dickinson and Slavery offered us a chance to do some things that we really like to help bring aspects of the past to life for classrooms. We start with digital work. So we have a website that we built about the Dickinson and Slavery Initiative as a way to showcase some of the research that we did. But then we developed a museum-style exhibit. The House Divided Project now has a studio on campus. It's almost like a museum. I teach there, and then there's also a space for exhibits. We have this beautiful exhibit now laid out that was student-produced and developed that describes the history of Dickinson and Dickinsonians and their ties to slavery, and also the movement against slavery, the abolitionist movement. And we finally developed and wrote a report that we shared with the campus last year. 2019 marked the 400th anniversary of slavery's unofficial existence in North America. The story of the first Africans being recorded as enslaved people in Virginia dates back to the summer of 1619. And in the summer of 2019, we submitted a report to the president's office about the school's ties to slavery. And then the president and the administration decided to create a renaming committee to address some of the issues raised by our work. And this led to a decision by the Board of Trustees recently to rename one building on campus and to open up the prospect of renaming some other buildings on campus, as well as undertaking a few other outreach efforts that I'll talk about in just a second. First, let me share my screen. I'm gonna pull up let's see. So you should be looking at the Dickinson Slavery website here. Make this a little bigger for me. We have a section on the site that describes the different eras of the college's experience with slavery, right up through the post-emancipation phase, when formerly enslaved people, like Henry Spradley, pictured here, worked as janitors on campus. One of the most remarkable stories that we discovered was the story of Robert Young, who's depicted here. This is a man who was a janitor on campus, the longest serving employee in the college's history up until the recent past. And he became a kind of civil rights leader in the community. He was the one who helped integrate the school in the 1880s. Robert Young wanted his son to attend school after he graduated from high school in Carlisle. They had never had a black student before, but they had just started admitting women, and the Carlisle Indian School had just developed, and some of the students there were beginning to attend classes at Dickinson, and the result was he made a push. The administration held him off for a time, but he went to the press, and the result was a series of newspaper articles all around the country about how a black man was trying to integrate the school. And eventually he wore them down, and they admitted his son into the prep school on campus. Robert Young's son only lasted on campus for about a year, and the memory of his experience on campus was kind of lost in the college history. But eventually, of course, in the early 20th century, the school was fully integrated with black graduates, both male and female. And the story of Robert Young has been kind of lost. We were able to recover it not because of any records on campus, but because of searching digital databases, finding the results of Young's effort while he was, fighting in the press. The website has a number of features. I'm just going to pull up one here. On the publications page, we have a report. That was the one that I talked about from August. And then we have a series of resources, including some of the press coverage that we have. And I wanted to try to share this video with you. This is from the Fox 43 coverage of the renaming. Let me pull up this video. I'll have to play through the initial ad here. Just give me a second.
College will soon consider changing the names of some buildings on campus. The buildings are named after people who supported slavery. 3 buildings are in question after a study by the school students. Fox 43's Jimmy Bittner is live on campus in Carlisle, Cumberland County with the hidden figures uncovered in the study, why some students say they should be honored instead.
This is just one of the buildings in question, the Armstrong building, and this is a conversation that's going to be happening across Dickinson College over the next few months.
Over 60% of Dickinson's founding board of trustees were slaveholders.
The students and professor behind the Dickinson and Slavery initiative, prepared by the House Divided Project, didn't set out to change the names of buildings on campus. However, when they were done, they recommended having the conversation.
Here is actually a portrait of Cooper.
The Thomas Cooper building is just one they want to talk about.
But then he goes to South Carolina and becomes a leading advocate of pro-slavery ideology.
That building was named after Cooper in the 1990s.
Not only was it named so recently, it was apparently named without knowledge of Cooper's ties to slavery.
Also on the list, buildings named after John Armstrong and John Montgomery, 3 figures the report found never renounced slaveholding.
So this is Robert Young.
Young is just one of the hidden figures students behind the study say they uncovered, who is not being honored right now.
Here's a janitor at Dickinson College who's a civil rights leader, and this is probably the most surprising finding in our report. He temporarily integrated the college in the 1880s.
And there are others.
Noah Pinckney, he's a Union Army veteran, a part of the U.S. colored troops. He was actually at Appomattox, the place where Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army surrendered.
Many students Fox 43 spoke to didn't even know the discussion was going on campus. They did agree, though, it's an important discussion to have.
In a predominantly white school, I feel like it's very important to showcase everyone's perspective.
The African Americans have contributed to the building and to the campus, so why not represent them?
Either way, the students behind the study hope to get people talking and ask the question,
how should we remember these individuals that have been, as I said, written out of history for decades?
Dickinson College did release a statement. They say that a committee has been formed to discuss renaming the buildings. Meantime, the committee's recommendations will then go to the Board of Trustees, and they commend the thoughtful conversation that has surrounded this entire discussion. If you want to read this entire report, I posted it on fox43.com. Live in Carlisle, Cumberland County, Jamie Bittner, Fox 43 News.
So that was Jamie Bittner in January. We had the renaming committee, which met and issued a report or recommendation to the Board of Trustees. And just last month, the board agreed and adopted with a series of changes that would take place next year. The first would be to rename Cooper Hall as Spradley Young Hall in honor of those 2 janitors that we mentioned, Henry Spradley and Robert Young. And then to rename East College Gate as the Pinckney Family Gate in honor of Noah Pinckney and his wife, Carrie Pinckney, who were both formerly enslaved people who were popular food sellers on campus. And then the report, also adopted by the Board of Trustees, agreed to help the House Divided Project, or have the administration continue to help the House Divided Project raise awareness about Dickinson and slavery through place markers, wayside markers on campus, online efforts, and also with conferences and events that we've been undertaking for the last several years and will continue to do to try to increase awareness and raise education. And then finally, and this is something we could talk about next, they set 2022 as a goal for further consideration of historic namesakes on the other residential halls, the old quads. Cooper Hall was one of those residential buildings. Montgomery House is outside of the quads, but it's also up for reconsideration in 2022, not as a way to address ties to slavery, but as a way to ask the question whether or not we should broaden and diversify our campus memory in light of the Dickinson Slavery report and the revelation that a lot of the historic names that we've put on buildings on campus are relatively new. The decision was made in the early 1990s. That decision was made based on a variety of factors, but perhaps it's time for us to consider going back to those factors and considering ways to address a wider framework of Dickinson's memory. I mean, the reason why I found the Robert Young and the Henry Spradley stories so compelling was simply because I think neither one of them had any kind of public recognition on campus commensurate with their role. They were influential figures. I mean, between the two of them, they had over 70 years of service on campus. They lived on campus. They were beloved by the students. They didn't always get treated equally, but they were important figures. They did more for the campus, for example, than Thomas Cooper did as a professor in 4 years. And so, you know, there's something to be said about the need not to erase history. But in this case, these are people who've been, in effect, kind of victimized by being erased by an earlier version of history. you know, I am a historian, so I know that there's nothing sacred about history, and especially nothing sacred about public memory. It changes. You have to learn things. You have to be open to encountering new evidence or new ways of thinking about old evidence. And I feel like that's one of the benefits of the Dickinson and Slavery Project. So that's where we are now. The board has adopted most of the recommendations of the renaming committee, and now we're opening up for a possible second round of renaming in 2022 based on a wider variety of circumstances. So I thought what I should do is pause here and well, let me say this. I think I've got a few people here who were involved in the project. Let's see. Rachel Morgan, is she on the call here? If you are, Rachel, would you just speak up for a minute and say hello? And if you have any comments or reflections on your role in working on the project, please feel free.
Yes, hello. My name is Rachel Morgan. I graduated 2018. I was actually in the slavery class in the fall of 2017. And my final project for that was doing research on Benjamin Rush, the founder of Dickinson College, who was publicly an abolitionist, but what was interesting about that, he did own a slave for a period of years named William Grubber. So I was focusing a lot on kind of thinking about how he was able to rationalize that abolitionist idea while also being a slaveholder himself, which I thought was really interesting because it never even occurred to me that there were people back then who were able to think like that and act like that. So that was a really good opportunity to be able to explore that, and I was really grateful for it.
Thanks. And Rachel did a great job. Her project on Rush is featured embedded in the Dickinson and Slavery website. It's on the Benjamin Rush page. He is a really complicated figure. I think the way Rachel learned from him is the way I wish all students would learn from all study of historical figures. They're complicated, they change, they can surprise you. You can learn a lot from that. So thank you, Rachel. I think Al Maslin's on the call. Now, Al was on the renaming committee. Al, did you want to speak up and offer any reflections on your role in the process?
Just one quick thought, because I think you're doing fine on your own, Professor. You don't really need my help. But one of the things that the committee tried to do was really look
Here.
at the positive input of many other people, African Americans, women, and that is really where I think we're starting. But as we go to 2022, I think it's very likely that we'll look beyond just African Americans and women, but a lot of other minority groups who have contributed to campus over the years, over the century.
Thanks, Al. Is there anybody else on the call? I can't see all the names quickly enough, but if there's anybody else on the call who was involved in the project at any stage, would you speak up now? Okay. So now, does anybody on the call want to ask a question or make a comment? If it's too unruly, we can go to the chat function, but I could start off by just asking if anybody wants to speak up, and we'll see how that works. And then if not, Andrew and I can moderate a little bit.
I'm happy to speak up. My name's Hannah Glick. I'm class of 2015. I actually was fortunate enough to attend a mosaic where I studied the migration of the slave trade and traveled to Ghana with Professor Johnson and Joyce Bylander in the summer and fall of 2013. It was an incredible eye-opening experience, and I'm really happy that Dickinson is kind of continuing this work to really examine, the historical sites on campus that, have a difficult history to understand. With this project, I unfortunately am just really getting caught up to speed about it now. But with this project, what role or shifts is the college seeing in this work for first-year students moving forward to help kind of implement and educate those who are new to this work in general, but also just kind of new to campus?
So last fall, I taught a freshman seminar on Dickinson and slavery. I thought it went really well. It's a challenging subject for first-year students, but I didn't think that uh, it was too difficult at all. I thought it was provocative, and the students really did well with it. We didn't just focus on Dickinson. We talked about some of these broader issues that are percolating right now, like memory involving Confederate monuments, or how to deal with the legacy of slavery in public policy. The students read the 1619 Project from the New York Times. But we also used Dickinson as a lens, and students did projects about Dickinsonians. One of those projects was about a young kid from Carlisle who didn't go to Dickinson, but he went off to war, fought for the Union Army, and ended up, he fought for the Union, but he hated emancipation. He thought it was wrong that he had to risk his life to free Black people. And his letters are in our library in the archives. And she did a really powerful project using his letters, and it won a prize for freshman seminar students in their research. And I think your question raises the other issue, which is, what about other seminars, and how can we broaden the impact of a program like this on those seminars? And I'm hopeful that when the Board of Trustees endorsed the idea of outreach from the House Divided Project to raise awareness, they had in mind ways that we could get all of the students in the freshman seminar program through the exhibit that you saw Cooper showing to Jamie Bittner from Fox 43, and talking about this. I think that would be appropriate and a good use of their time. I'm not always going to teach a seminar each semester on Dickinson and slavery, but I think most freshmen would benefit from that kind of experience. Does anybody else want to jump in?
Hi, I'm Corinthia Jacobs. I'm class of 2011. I emailed you last night. Thank you so much for getting back to me. As I mentioned, my Africana Studies thesis while I was at Dickinson was on this very topic, reviving and revising the history of Dickinson College from an Africanist perspective. So this is a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart, because I spent a year basically revisiting and revising Dickinson's history from an Africanist lens and putting that together. And so I'm really interested in your project, and I have a lot of questions, but we can talk about that offline. I guess my main question would be, how are you amplifying? I know you said that there were African-American students that are, or alumni that are taking part in your research, but how are you amplifying that work? And this is not just about me, because when I did do the research, I was able to cite sources from, decades ago where they had already done the research. And there was a part of it that was like a psychological component about the names of the buildings, and I think of how that affects its students of color, that I was really able to dive into by looking at diaries of past students and people who were a part of the Pan-African movement in the 60s. And all of that research I had done in basically the archive. So are you guys taking any steps to basically highlight the people who have done the work, the people of color who have, have been keeping this, this research alive? And are there any, plans to kind of uplift them and amplify that?
Okay, so I said before, right? Historians have to keep an open mind about new evidence and about new approaches. And so Corinthia emails me the other day and says she did this thesis about Noah Pinckney and, like she just said, the Africanist lens for understanding Dickinson history. And I had never heard of her thesis before. So right away, after spending 3 years working on this project, I realized I don't actually know everything about what's been done in the past on this story. So the first question I have for Corinthia, which is what I put to her in the email, was, are we going to be able to put your thesis on the website?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure.
I lost it. It was on my old computer that crashed, but I'm sure Professor Johnson still has it. And she and I still keep in touch. And I'm pretty sure Moon Sammy has it as well. Yeah. So I'll definitely be able to pull that. But I guess my main thing is not just I just want to make sure that African-American students aren't getting lost in this process, of the whole kind of renaming thing. And I want to make sure that they actually are part of recreating, not recreating history, but recreating a vision of Dickinson moving forward.
Right. Well, some of that's beyond my control, but let me tell you one story where I think it illustrates what you want to see. So I work with Professor Johnson occasionally on different projects, but two different departments. We don't cross paths very often. But one of her students, a couple of years ago, did a blog post for her, a kind of research project online about Robert Young. And at the same time, my students and I were working on Robert Young for the Dickinson Slavery project. I never would have known about that, except they were working online. So we found Najee Thompson's post about Robert Young. And she's an African-American student, was very active in a variety of efforts on campus to try to do more to create a better appreciation for diversity on campus. But I had never met her. I never had her in class, but I read her post online. This is one of the great advantages of the internet. It allows you to meet people you might not otherwise meet. And so I brought her in, interviewed her, and gave her an internship. And she worked on the Dickinson Slavery project. She's one of the 10 students we featured as main contributors to the project. And she's also featured in the video. One of the students featured in the video discussing the Dickinson Slavery project. And she just recently graduated last year. But I think her story illustrates to you, I think, the value of having different voices in the room for a project like this. Like, I don't want to, I don't want to, I don't want to give her undue credit for shaping or framing the final report, but she was the student who stood up and said, it occurred to me walking around campus as a student of color that I had a slaveholder's name on my sweatshirt every day. And I was proud of it, but it raised, troubling questions for her. Yes. She's the student whose quotation is featured in the introduction of the report. And I thought it was a very powerful way to frame this. It didn't make her demoralized. It didn't make her want to rip Dickinson's name off the campus, but it raised important questions for her. And I thought those are the kind of questions people need to hear.
Well, I have a bunch of questions again that I'll just, ping you about offline, but that brings me to my next question. How do you kind of reconcile the idea that a lot of the buildings, I would say 75% of the buildings on Dickinson's campus were named after slave owners. And, Rachel, I know she mentioned that she had done some work on Benjamin Rush, but he might have owned one slave, but many of his experiments were unscientific, and 99% of them were done on Black people. And I mean, everything from, using acid to try to turn Black people white, essentially. He was not a good person, but yet his statue stands in the middle of campus. And that's something that I know a lot of people aren't familiar with that information, but because that was my work, and I'm just a curious person about what is going on, what are these monuments to? So I always have kind of done the digging. How do you reconcile that? Or how is somebody supposed to reconcile that?
Well, everybody has to make their own decisions on these things. The facts are complicated. I don't agree with the way you portrayed all of those facts, but it is something that it's the subject for real debate when you talk about someone like Rush and his role in American history. But I can tell you this: as soon as we started working on Rush for this report, I got bombarded by a number of Rush admirers and fans who thought we were being far too critical of him. And one of the things we did in the exhibit to try to raise the kind of question you're raising was we photoshopped the statue of Rush in the exhibit space, where in one of his hands he had a ball and chain to symbolize his connection to slavery. And in the other hand, of course, he had the book, which represents his attachment to the Enlightenment. And we tried to show the contradiction inherent, in his story. Somebody who's this progressive, enlightened figure, and then someone who also is perhaps hypocritical about some of those values. And we got a whole lot of criticism from people who thought we were being unfair to him. I don't think you would find that unfair at all, but there were
Same
There's
kind
a
of
whole range of views on this issue. And so
like on a national level, people, have this same conversation with Christopher Columbus, right? And like, how do you reconcile like, what he means to some people versus what he means to a very large number of other people? And what are we supposed to do with this information?
right, you could take almost every important historical figure from almost any era, but especially from the 18th and 19th century, and you'll find elements of their life and values that don't fit with our idea of what makes a good person. Like the way you said Rush was a bad person. Maybe by our standards, it's clear. By their standards, perhaps not so clear. But how do you reconcile that? As a teacher, my job, I feel, is to get students to do that for themselves and to try to give them a range of materials where they can make a decent decision on their own. We all have our own opinions. Some of us have strong opinions, but I tried to create a project with my students that would raise questions and not force answers. That's where we ended up as best we could.
Okay, well, thank you again for doing this. Like I said, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I'd like to keep in touch with you.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the call.
Is it
Okay, who wants to speak next?
Is it okay if I just jump into the conversation about Rush? Yeah, because, right. So just kind of to add to what Corinthia was saying, when I was researching Rush, there was his abolitionist beliefs, his being a slave owner. There was the experiments, and I believe also the fact that he thought being Black was a form of eczema was something like that. His medical expertise at the time, I think, even then was being criticized. Just, it's kind of an unrelated example, but him still thinking that bloodletting was a valid medical practice even after everyone told him it wasn't. And I think when it comes to Rush specifically, when it comes to reconciling, I feel like he's a perfect example of this whole conversation, because you have, on the one hand, he claimed he was an abolitionist. On the other hand, he treated Black people very badly. And so I think a way to reconcile that is different aspects of him mean different things to different people. And I think another thing to keep in mind, for his time period, he was pretty radical when it came to the abolitionist thing. But then you look at it now, and it's the complete opposite of what we consider it. And I take a slightly different viewpoint from Professor Pinsker, I think, in that just because people thought it was okay back then doesn't necessarily mean it was right. But I do think if we're going to try and reconcile these different views of these historical people, we need to acknowledge everything that they represent. And I think it's hysterical that people were giving you a hard time for being too mean to Rush. Like, that's what we do. We're historians. We're mean to people.
So what I really like about that answer is I got Rachel finally to disagree with me. So when she was a student, she would disagree occasionally, but very cautiously. Now that she's a graduate and a law student, I like the fact that she's more willing to stake out her own ground there. I appreciate that.
I don't have to worry about my grades anymore.
That's right. But I do think that the reason why it's important to understand these guys in context is because it teaches us to be a little more humble about what we think we know to be right and wrong. Just to put it in, kind of slang terms, Rush was the Dr. Fauci of his day. Everybody respected him. He was incredibly learned and very effective in so many ways. Now we see the flaws that seem so obvious to us, but weren't so obvious then. And you can judge somebody pretty harshly if you use present day terms. I'm certainly not forbidding or discouraging people from judging the evils of slavery. Don't get me wrong. But I do wish everybody on either or any side of this issue just approaches it with plenty of humility, because I think one day people are going to judge us, and we may not come up to their standards. So we need to remember that. Okay, does somebody else want to jump in, comment, or ask a different question?
Professor Pinsker.
Yes.
Bill Kennedy, 72. If indeed Benjamin Rush conducted horrific medical experiments on Black slaves, will the 2020 renaming committee consider, well, sending them off campus? I mean, maybe taking down that statue. I mean, that bothers me. The medical experiments really bothers me. It seems that's much worse than, I won't say mere slavery, but it bothers me.
So the plan at this stage is to look at the 9 residential halls besides Cooper that were named in the early 1990s, and to take a second look at Montgomery House, which was named after John Montgomery, an early trustee who was a slaveholder and a slave trader. There's no plan to look at Benjamin Rush. However, you know, as you can tell by what's happening around us today, things change, plans change, it's possible. I don't agree with the way Corinthia characterized his medical story entirely. So if his name was subject to some debate, there would be a debate, you know, about what exactly we're characterizing as his role as a medical practitioner. I'll just go back to what I said before, and I think Rachel mentioned this too. This is a man who thought bloodletting was the cure to a lot of diseases, and he could be pretty tough by our standards on a number of people, white, black, yellow, and brown. He thought he was doing right, even though we know now he was doing wrong. So, you know, to be determined whether or not Rush is ever going to be the subject to a renaming debate. But at this stage, it's not part of the focal point of the plans that the Board of Trustees voted on the other day. Does anybody else want to comment on that or raise a different question?
I could jump back in here again. I did have my own question. So obviously with everything that's going on right now, I feel like this whole project is more relevant than ever. We see, like you mentioned, more statues are coming down. I understand that just today NASCAR banned the Confederate flag. And you also see all these other initiatives to try and raise more awareness of Black history. I know there's a petition going around to name the Apollo Theater as a Broadway house, because right now of 41 Broadway houses, none of them are owned by Black people. So I guess my question would be, with this project and kind of keeping in mind everything that's going on right now, teaching Dickinson slavery going forward, operating House Divide going forward, to what extent do you see yourself kind of using that as a starting point to really dive into the current events more so than we probably have in the past?
I have to admit, I'm always reluctant to dive into current events as a historian. I know that, like I said at the beginning, this stuff is relevant to today. You know, but I worry, especially as a classroom teacher, I worry that, you know, students will feel pressured by me if I take strong positions in the classroom on one thing or the other. So I try to be careful about that. On the other hand, you know, I'm a citizen, I have political views, you know, I want to see change in certain ways. Like I said to you and Corinthia and, you know, others, I'm humble about judging past historical figures. You know, I don't think that you have to look at the Dickinson Slavery Initiative as a way to punish wrongdoing in the past. I think of it more as a way to raise awareness about heroic figures like Robert Young or Henry Stradley or Noah Pinckney, who've been ignored too much in the past and deserve more credit for what they did against great obstacles. And so that was what I was in some ways proudest of in the project. And that's what I'd like to continue to do, because I guarantee you there's more figures in the Dickinson story. Al kind of alluded to this. There's more figures in the Dickinson story that we don't know about, that we should and could, and we could celebrate their role in the college's history. Does anybody else want to jump in with a question or a comment?
Have you had an opportunity to go a little bit wider and explore the attitudes towards slavery in Carlisle or Cumberland County?
Yes, we did. So, you know, it wasn't a full examination, but in order to understand the role of slaveholding among the trustees and whether or not how slaves were hired out to the college, we looked at research that's been done on Cumberland County slaveholding. And if you go to the website and you enter the section on the founding era, you'll see a map of slaveholding in Cumberland County and some descriptions of the role of what slaveholding was like and how the Abolition Act worked in the county and how slavery eventually died out in the county. So we did some of it, a starting point, and there's more to be done. Okay, anybody else want to jump in with comments or questions? I want to make sure I give space.
Yeah, Greg Bedlow, class of 1970 history major. And I was fascinated by this whole project and wasn't aware of it. I hope the college can perhaps do a better word about these, their job of getting word about these kind of projects out to the alumni. The other thing I would request is if you do get Corinthia's paper, can you post it somewhere on your site? Because I'd be interested in reading that.
Right. So the whole point of me harassing Corinthia on this Zoom call was to get that paper so that we could post it on the website. That's what I was asking her to do. But if you saw the video from Fox 43 that I showed a few minutes ago, they kept interviewing students who didn't know a thing about the project. And I was so frustrated because we spent 3 years, at least 2 of them, with all campus emails, with posters, with events. We had a panel that was televised by C-SPAN, and yet people still don't know about it. So it's hard to break through when people are busy and distracted with everything. But you're right, we're gonna have to keep trying. Raising awareness is a relentless struggle, but we'll keep at it.
Yeah, I'll definitely send you my work that I did on this, but I just also wanted to note again that there have been other people, Black people and people of color in particular, who there's a plethora of names. So I don't necessarily agree with naming buildings after servant workers who weren't allowed to be on campus. For example, there are plenty of African-American students who went on to do great things at Dickinson College, and perhaps maybe take a look at them and highlight them in their works. And I have a list of people that I suggest in my paper as well. But as they are important, and I'm not sure if you know, but the East Gate was already named Noah Pinckney Gate. I know because that was at my suggestion when President Durden flew me back to give a speech on the naming of the East Gate to the Noah Pinckney Gate. And we specifically put it there because that is where he worked out of, and we brought him onto the campus. So there's a plaque right outside the East Gate with his name on it. And that's, to my knowledge, the only recognition of African-American people that is on the campus.
Okay, so, this is the craziest story about the Noah Pinckney plaque. According to the college records, it's not named the Noah Pinckney Gate. There's a plaque that Corinthia talked about, but when she and I had this email exchange just yesterday, it forced me to go back and look at all the notes on the plaques to Noah Pinckney. And some of this stuff I didn't have right in my head, but I think I understand it now. And Corinthia may not remember it this way, but I think this is right. We can talk about it later to sort it all out. But the first plaque to Noah Pinckney was from 1951. And it was put on campus by students, alumni who remembered Pinckney from his days in the early 20th century. And then in the 1970s, it got stolen or vandalized and taken away, and they replaced it with another plaque. And then that plaque was taken down for, they said, refurbishing. And I guess it wasn't on the wall there near East College. And that's when Corinthia stepped in, and this part of it I didn't know. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when you got them to write new text for the plaque to put up there, because the old text was kind of patronizing in an old-fashioned way.
Yeah, it was basically, he was mocked by a lot of the white students. And so there was just this kind of Noah it was just this maybe nursery rhyme. And so that was the plaque that was up, and it was outside of the gate. So we removed that plaque. We had a new plaque resurrected that talked about his biography and his life, and moved it to inside of the gate.
Right. But according to the college records, it's not named the Pinckney Gate. And so, the Board of Trustees had to officially adopt that name. And what we did, and I haven't seen your paper yet, so I don't know how much attention you gave to Carrie Pinckney, but one of the things we did in the Dickinson Slavery report is we did an awful lot of research into Pinckney's family. He had two families, a first marriage and children, and then a second marriage with Carrie Pinckney, who was known as Aunt Noah on campus. And she was just as important as Noah Pinckney in terms of the students and their experience, but she's not remembered in any of the plaques, kind of forgotten. And so we got the Board of Trustees to agree to call this the Pinckney Family Gate, naming it after both Noah and Carrie Pinckney, which I think, is a form of progress here.
I agree.
Okay. So we're all learning from each other, hopefully. Okay. Does anybody else want to jump in with a different question or another comment?
Yeah, first of all, this is all news we can use. I'm Robert Featherstone from 1970, and a lot was going on during the time I was there. But I think I attended the first section of Black History, which I think was in my sophomore year, maybe junior. But we all knew who Benjamin Rush was. We knew that he was a bleeder, but he wasn't in charge of the medical unit. And we also knew had this idea that without Rush, there would have been no school. We all knew who John Dickinson was. And then, of course, the other two names, Boyd Lee Spar and Anita Tuvin Schlechter, because of the buildings. I haven't a clue as to, and I go to the campus every 5 years for a reunion. I haven't a clue as to who any of these other people are. So I think it's really useful to increase awareness. I didn't even know until just this hour that they had renamed the buildings on the quad. I mean, I knew they had to call them something, I just didn't know what. So this is, and of course, before Zoom and internet, these kinds of sessions never took place. So let me thank you for doing this.
Thanks. But of course, I have to tell you, what you just described is my greatest fear about this project. We're going to rename Cooper Hall Spradley Young Hall. And I fear that in about 3 or 4 years, none of the students are going to know who Spradley is or who Young is, because you walk past these buildings and you don't think twice about the names. It's human nature. So we're going to have to work really hard to, keep the awareness alive for, a generation or so at least.
Well, maybe if there were, at least for the people who go in the buildings, if there were a plaque somewhere that had just the basics. Now, a lot of buildings, there are a number of buildings on campus that I never set foot in, but many I did. Ones that I had classes and lived in, and so at least if there was some awareness there, or now that we have websites and things like that, that's also a useful way to.
Yeah, that's a really smart comment. What I'm hoping that the Board of Trustees has approved, and I haven't gotten final, budgetary approval for this, but our plan, what we proposed to the president was that we would have wayside markers and exhibit panels outside and inside with pictures that would describe these people. As great as Corinthia's work was in getting that plaque put back up after they took it down and the text improved, there's no pictures on that plaque. And so I always think pictures is such a powerful thing. And if we do officially name that gate the Pinckney Family Gate, we'll have a wayside marker there with pictures of both Noah and Carrie Pinckney, which I think will make it even more powerful. And I think we should also make sure on these markers and exhibit panels, we explain the former names like Cooper and why we're changing them. That's something we talked about in the renaming committee. It's very important to explain to people why we've made a change so that they can appreciate how things can change. All right, any other questions or comments? We probably have about 5 minutes left.
I thought this was a very measured and very informative program. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, last call. Is there any other comment? And if it wants to be constructive in its criticism, I'll take that too. You don't have to always offer compliments, but is there anybody who wants to say anything else?
Yes. Hi, can I say something? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, Mary Jenkins, 1970 also. This is our 50th reunion. how are you dealing at all with the fact that Dickinson, from what I understand, was a very pro-Southern campus before and during the Civil War? And I'm thinking, as I understand, when Lincoln was inaugurated, he was surrounded by 2 Dickinson graduates, neither of whom we particularly want to memorialize. I'm thinking of Buchanan and Taney. And I understand, as I said, that many of the people that were going to Dickinson left and fought for the Confederates.
Well, look, it's the right question, but I do think you're wrong in one particular. Sure, there were plenty of pro-Southern people on campus at Dickinson, and there were these figures like Tawney and Buchanan who were anti-Lincoln, anti-Republican, and they didn't think of themselves necessarily as pro-Southern. They thought of themselves as Unionists, but they were not the kind of Unionists that we would support today. They were pro-slavery in many ways. But the campus was divided, just like the country. I mean, there was a strong contingent of anti-slavery forces. We call this the Dickinson and Slavery Project, but I really imagine it as the Dickinson and Slavery and Anti-Slavery Project. Just too cumbersome to include all of that in the title. But it's about the battle over slavery, and the college had a battle over slavery, just like the country. And for me, that's the lesson of American history. It's not one thing or the other. It's the constant battle between these things that makes it interesting, and it's the reason why we have to study it, learn from it, and keep fighting for what we think is right into the future.
There's also the autograph book, if we want to talk about student environment on campus during that time period.
Yeah, one of Rachel's great projects when she was a student on this effort was she did a video about an autograph book that Northern and Southern students signed to each other as they're about to leave campus in April 1861 to go fight each other. It's a video that's on the Dickinson and Slavery site in the sectional crisis section. It's really moving. I'll give her full credit for doing a great job with that.
I'll give partial credit to Sam because I'm not good at editing videos.
Yeah, there's another student involved in that project as well. Okay, one final comment from someone. If there's someone out there who wants to make it, please go ahead.
Yeah, just one other thing. I think I really enjoyed this session as well, but also on these issues like renaming buildings and looking at the history of the college's past. Please remember you've got a lot of alumni out there who are also professional historians and might have something to contribute too, so try to reach out.
Definitely. We've got we've got a wide network of people at Dickinson.
I think it just ended.
Did he
we
leave
might have
us?
we might have lost Matt for a minute. Hold on a minute.
Well, while he's gone, I can give you a little bit more information on Rush. From the Dickinson website, it says that Rush also mixes views on race with his interests in physical science and firm religious beliefs. Eager to prove that all human beings descended from one pair, Adam and Eve, he came to think that the disease of leprosy caused blackness and skin color. A cure, therefore, would change African skin color back to white, thereby allowing Rush to support his Christian creationism. And then we'll fast forward, the experimentation of another scientist who applied nitric acid, a harsh corrosive to the skin on the hair of an African-American man. And this was something that Rush implemented into his own personal practices.
Yeah, it was not pleasant.
Yeah, I just wanted to give some context because Professor Pinsker said he disagreed with my research.
I thought it was eczema at first, but I remember the leprosy thing.
I hope Matt comes back on.
this is Al Maslin. I think the rule was that if the professor was 5 minutes late to class, you could leave. I'm suggesting that if the professor slips out 5 minutes early, we can leave too. So I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
So long, everyone.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Mac just said his power went out because of a storm that's in the area. So he says goodbye to everybody and thank you for joining tonight, guys.
Thank you all.